Hey there, students. So today we're going to be talking about, as we talked about perspectives in the last lecture, we're going to be talking about culture in this lecture. So essentially, we're going to be talking about the infrastructure and the social settings that surround you, the things that help mold you, build your expectations, some of the funny and interesting things about cultures, such as ways that we experience other cultures and then may not know exactly how we fall into it, which is known as culture shock. And we'll cover that in a few slides here. But essentially, we're going to be looking at the totality of what is culture. What is it? If someone says that you're cultured, they tend to refer to that in a positive light, right? Like, oh, that person's very cultured. Yes, this person has a very good understanding of this, that, and this. That means because reality is there's different types of socialization, which we'll cover in a further lecture, but different cultures build upon our expectations of developing the self of who we are. How we understand the world around us is very much intertwined with the culture that we are within. Now, when you think about culture, you may think about, oh, well, I'm an American, so I have a very Americanized culture, or I'm somebody who was raised as a person of color in this country, and I learned a lot of different cultural values, or we do it for culture. We've heard that expression, right? So you start to see how this thing known as culture can really play into our shaping the expectations of our reality. So I'm going to be taking you through quite a few slides here, and then we are going to be looking at what is culture in our everyday lives. How does that match our understanding and expectations? So in front of you, you will see some slides, right? Culture and you, in this fun little moving slide deck. It's not that special, but what is culture? So I'm going to take you through that. So here we go. Culture essentially is the totality of learned, socially transmitted behavior that is passed down from generation to generation. Pause. That is one of the most important things. We transfer our cultural identity, the things that our parents taught us, our grandparents taught our parents, the great-grandparents taught our grandparents, and how that experience molds, shapes, and builds our perception and understanding of reality. It helps build the subjective view through objective understanding, things that we understand. And this can be shared beliefs. Think about the customs, the values, the traditions. Why do we dine a certain way? Why do we eat a certain food in certain celebrations? My wife is Polish, and on the day for Christmas, Christmas Eve, we eat a certain food that is supposed to personify the year that we're going to have wealth. You have to have this sesame cake. It's a big deal. So the collective thought and other concepts adhered to by members of a particular culture. So think about the things that we share. If someone says, oh, do you understand that I'm this, right? So when you think of that, what you're looking at is these shared experiences. Durkheim calls this mechanical solidarity. And we'll get to Durkheim's theories on this in a little bit, but essentially these cultural elements and dynamics that we share embody and make us who we are. So culture provides the context for the way of our life, as it says on the slide. We understand the world through the eyes, the lenses of those who have raised us. Think back to the perspectives lectures that we watched, right? So this understanding of the world and how it shapes us are governed by rules and norms and how we engage and interact with one another. We learn this through the process of diffusion of cultural values that are transmitted through our family, through the people that surround us. So culture exactly in definition refers to everything that people create. Now, this is a big part of this course. Society, culture, those things around us, these are all social constructions, things that we have built and transmitted and passed down and diffused through generation to generation that runs itself. I've mentioned in earlier class, but Durkheim famously says that society is bigger than the grade of its part of its sums, right? So it'll be there before us. It wasn't there before us. It exists now and it will last after us. So we have created this living and breathing concept that passes down. But it's also why it's important to protect cultural traditions, because if we don't, then they may not be transferred down and they could be lost. Think about all the different civilizations that have been lost through time. And that's because if people stop practicing, it tends to be omitted. People stop wanting to learn that, and then we lose these traditions. So a culture is a shared perspective. It's not an absolute truth. What is definitive to my culture and the one that I grew up within, I'm Irish, is not going to be the same for you. Let's say if you are a Mexican American or Italian American or something in that regard, you're going to be taught different cultural values. There is no absolute truth towards the perspectives around culture. Culture or society is a social construction, and it can be entirely different. It can be entirely correct, but it's understanding of your world around you. So there are, and this is important for your quizzes and tests, etc. There are different types of culture. There's non-material and there's material culture. Now, material culture is a physical item that has cultural meaning, meaning that we have establish it having a value, right? Money, the construct of economics, is all something we've created. We have decided how money is transferable. That dollar that we know here in the United States means nothing to Europeans who use the euro, right? So the material culture that we have established behind it, that this piece of paper has currency, is very important. So bus passes, plane tickets, automobiles, stores, and even when physical structures where people worship, such as churches. If you were in my lecture hall, the lecture hall, this is a material culture. It has a purpose because the building has been given a material meaning. It has a physical reason why we have to find it important. For those of you who have ever thought about going into architecture or interior architecture, repurposing is a big thing, right? There's a hospital on Shea on the way down from North down to Carefree/Cave Creek in this area that was once a Fry's grocery store. The building wasn't changed in the sense of being a new building. What was once a grocery store was repurposed into a hospital. It has a new material culture. Now, non-material culture refers to the ideas, attitudes, and beliefs of a society. So that ability to transform things into having meaning, a physical meaning, is the idea of the non-material. Think about an example in your book, where Mumbai and shoving and how that would be perceived in America. People in Mumbai shove each other to make more space in these tight, packed buses, which is part of their material culture. The belief and understanding that this is a norm and people accept this and that it's not seen as aggression is part of the non-material culture in that reference. Buying a book for your classes, the book would be the material part, right? But the purchasing of the book to accept the ideas of payment for your education, that ties again still that you're paying with money. And the capitalistic part of having an education connects to the non-material culture. If I ask you to buy a book, you're going to buy the book because the material culture is the book, you're buying the thing, but the material within it, information inside of it, is the non-material that you're accepting that this is where you're going to learn your lectures. So it's very important here to pay attention to what is material culture, what is non-material culture. I want you to think about some examples of this. In class, I'd ask you to raise your hand, but for this, think of some examples of a material culture versus a non-material culture when they intersect, and try to write that on yellow dick. So let's take this a little further and talk about culture and society. Culture consists of rules of engagement. Simple enough. All of us know how we should or shouldn't act. Why do you know that? Well, you've been cultured and socialized to know that. And each culture has different rules that apply in how we, as members of a society, and interact and engage with each other. Different cultures have different ways of engaging with one another. Your slide has the example of England and America. We're very good about non-important pleasantries, right? Hi, how are you? Oh, I'm so sorry. Having conversations when we walk our dogs, right? In England, there's no purpose behind a conversation that isn't going to prosper further, right? I want you to also think about this. Think of some different rules of engagement. Some cultures, it's very, very proper to burp after a meal because you said the cook was very good. Oh, I'm so full, I had to burp, right? In America, that would be rude. So these engagements and these non-material cultures guide our understanding of the world. And we build our understanding of how we're supposed to engage with one another versus how we're not. Europeans, kissing on the cheek. Americans, we find that weird, right? These are non-material culture dynamics of physical and non-physical importance. So culture and society are not commonly separated by the average person. But in sociology, the difference is important. A society describes a group of people who share a community. So these are people who are within a community, and they may have different cultural values, but the society as a whole is the big macro coverage over it. Culture represents the beliefs and practices of a group. So you can have a society with various cultural elements, but the culture people follow is the beliefs and the practices they follow within that group. Again, think about Americans when we say hi, we either do a gesture like shaking hands or a hug, but in Europe, it's very common, even with strangers, to give a kiss on the cheek. In some cultures, how many kisses matters on how close you are to them, right? So you can find many of these examples. Again, I encourage you to have this conversation for all of you who are from different cultural backgrounds on Yellow Dick. But it is important to understand that a society as well as a culture cannot exist without one another. They are one and the same, different, but they intersect constantly and are commonly not separated by most people. With sociology, we do separate them because we want to see the differences between the collective group in the community and how each culture represents their personal beliefs and practices. So there are many different intricacies when it comes to societies and cultures, and many times you will find new norms, values, understandings when you go travel to different places. This is what we call cultural universals. There are cultural universals and there are cultural particulars. You feel free to read all this on this slide, but I'm going to go through it quickly here. Cultural universals are essentially patterns that are globally commonly understood by all societies. One of these is murder. easiest one to example, right? Murder, necrophilia, incest in most cases, things that when you go somewhere, everyone will have an understanding of what you mean. One example of this, it's not all the same, but the idea of it's the same, is a family. Many people throughout the entire world, if you say family, will know what that means. Now, what that looks like would be more cultural particular, meaning that each culture has a different breakdown of it. It's not the same everywhere, but the construct of it would be seen as a cultural universal. You could ask someone on the idea of a family, or many times, as it's changing now, but the idea of roles inside a family has been very commonly culturally universal, but incest and taboo have also been seen that based on religious standpoints, right? Historically, incest wasn't considered wrong. Now it is considered wrong. So we see shifts and oscillations between patterns of what is universals and what are particulars. But it's important to understand that what you may see as a norm may not be followed by other people. That's why there's universals and there's particulars. And you have to know what is going to transfer everywhere versus what is not. The idea of paying for something, universal. Types of currencies, particular, because we don't share the same economy, right? All people become hungry. This is universal, but the potential food sources defined by the culture and the rules and beliefs of how we eat it, this may be particular, right? Some cultures do not allow beef, some do, but we are all hungry. That's the universal. Hopefully I put that through there. Those are important terms, cultural universals and cultural particulars. I will be using them throughout the semester, so make sure you have a good understanding of that. Also, good conversation for Yellow Dig again. So let's talk about values and beliefs. Well, values is what is considered good or valuable. Happiness, individual freedom, consumption, security, right? These are things many people hold to as being good. Beliefs are what is considered to be true. They don't necessarily have to have an objective truth. I believe in God. You may not believe in God. I am personally not a believer, but I understand that people are believers. But if you believe things on blind faith, they're based on beliefs, experiences, traditions, and sciences. Believing that a child should have one parent at home is a belief. It's not set as a value. That's not something we all agree upon what is considered good or valuable. But over time, that shifts, right? You talk about in the past, it used to be that we always had one parent home, and in many times there was gender roles established, and many women were at home. And now as women are going to the workforce, that doesn't hold to be considered what is a value for everybody. It's a belief. So what we do believe leads to happiness or success. It can, but it's something that we hold tight to ourselves. So know that there's a difference between values and beliefs. Another great conversation. So let's dive a little deeper into that. Individuals in society have specific beliefs, but what is powerful is that individuals can share collective values. I may have beliefs, but I might have values that we share collectively. This can be illustrated within the concept of the American dream, a collective value that wealth is good and important. We come here with the value and the belief that we're going to be able to make money. And that then goes into the idea of what we see as important. Many times you'll see a collective value behind beauty, wealth, importance, fame, power, prestige. Many people have different ways of viewing this, but all are trying to achieve this. Beauty with the attractiveness bias is universally understood, and many people have that as a value, something that's just seen as good, to be beautiful. Think about how many times when you meet a new child of your brother, sister, siblings, or family, you're like, oh, well, the kid's really cute. Oh, you have a cute kid. Photos later, oh, your daughter's so beautiful. Like, this is something, your son is so handsome. This is something that society sees as a value, it's considered as good. And values provide insight into what is called an ideal culture. And that's the standards of society would like to embrace and live up to this, right? The idea is the concept, but hardly becomes reality is that important when understanding the idea of a real culture or how society is based on what actually exists. This is Weber's idea, and it constitutes something I think about all the time, ideal versus real. We wish the world was free of crime, violence, and murder. That would be ideal. The reality is that the real world has problems and it has qualms, shifts, oscillations. So there's plenty of situations where you have this ideal versus real. Have a food shortage in an area, great, we'll open up fries. Well, the fries opens, that would be ideal. Now we have food, right? Well, all the small businesses now shut down. So what we start seeing is that the real solution was not what we wanted. Said differently, like on the slide, ideal culture wouldn't have automobile fatalities or accidents, murders, racism, gender inequalities, or homophobia. Real culture roles are held to try to combat this with individuals such as police, social workers, lawmakers, and educators to try to stop this. So we're working to try to make the world better each day. But the reality is that there are always going to be problems, and that is the realness behind the real culture. And the way that we try to fix this is through increasing it through lawmakers, social workers, etc. Right? They use what is called sanctions. These can be positive, these can be negative. You did a good thing, good job. You did a bad thing, punishment. Various ways to enforce this, but sanctions are how we use positive or negative to enforce norms, values, and social rules to be able to instill the values behind society. So, sociologist Robin M. Williams made a list of the 12 core American values. You're welcome to read this on your own. I'm not going to read it to you, but these have held up pretty well, I think. But these get updated. But this was in the 1970s. What were the values in the American culture? Feel free to read these on your own time. they are posted. But let's get to norms. Well, norms are shared rules or guidelines that guide our behaviors and actions. So why we do the things we do and we know they're wrong is because we've been socialized as towards what norms are. I know not to put my elbows on the table, when I'm eating, because I've been taught that's not norm. I shouldn't do that. That would fall into the category below here as a folkway, right? Less morally significant. Thou shalt not steal or kill, right? If you're religious, this was taught to you as a norm of wrongness. This would fall into what is called mores or moral. It's an easy way to think of that. These are highly necessary. Do not have relations with your family. This would be a taboo. It's a super more. It's something everyone agrees on. It's a cultural universal. We shouldn't do these things. Murdering somebody, taboo, right? Mores are commonly connected to laws in the sense of physical things that we know, like they're written down things we shouldn't do, wrongs that are considered highly necessarily wrong, right? Norms tied to mores also have this. Folkways are less morally significant. More commonly, you'll know things like you shouldn't wear dirty clothes, right? This would be the idea of of a folkway. So understanding this, we'll be talking about this a lot, but mores, folkways, taboos, you're more than welcome to talk about this on Yellow Dig, but these guide our understanding of norms and how we act on a day-to-day basis. So let's dive a little bit more deeper when it comes to this idea of norms. Formal and informal sanctions. Essentially, a norm violations can vary in the way that culture deals with it and understands it. The sanctions or punishments vary on the type of infractions. If it's a formal written down law, you can be arrested, you can be taken to jail. You have a written down reason you can't do it. Informal, these fall into folkways more often, essentially pulling us to the idea of ways we may be shamed or shunned by our fellow peers in society. Mores tend to fall, or formal norms tend to fall into, you can get arrested, don't speed. Don't do these things. Another great conversation for your Yellow Dig, talking about some informal violations or formal positive actions or informal actions. Even we'll talk about ways that you've seen this type of interaction. Think about your parents when you were a kid. If you did bad things, did you get timeouts? Think about as you get older, if you were loitering or got in trouble with the police, how did that end up working? Did you know that you violated these norms? These are the ideas that we've established throughout our society to be able to build our understanding of our day-to-day interactions. So let's do more breakdown on this. Formal norms, they're established. I'm going to clear this quickly for you. There are established written rules. These are followed as such by we follow them. Laws, employee manuals, standards of procedures, no driving, or think about COVID, mask required. Informal, these can be behaviors that are generally widely conform to, right? Don't put your hands on the table, wash your hands before you eat. Things that if you do them, you'll be violating social contracts, you may be isolated or ostracized by your friends. Feel free to read this more if you want on your own time, but norms can vary towards their social importance or how we view them as deviants. So tying to the next area here, we're going to talk about symbols and language. Symbols are any object, feeling, gesture, idea that hold or shared meaning of culture. We talked about this a little bit, essentially, right? I gave you the idea of thumbs up. This ties to our understanding of the world, right? A ring on the left hand represents to most marriage of some type. Well, flip that on its side, right? There are meanings behind meanings. If a person wears a ring like this, I'm married, it means you're married, right? Well, if it's a black ring, if you didn't know this, it's actually a symbol, it's a symbol to show others that you may be a part of the swinging community. Also pineapples. I can tell you a lot about this, but the symbols, I like to study because I think it's funny. I'm not actually part of that group. But the symbols essentially here, what you're looking at are how we understand certain things. One of the biggest and best finds we ever had, right, with the Rosetta Stone, allowed us to translate other languages because of the symbols. They hold importance, ways that we can communicate. Think about the emojis that we have. One of the biggest separators between Gen Z and millennials is the use of how we understand emoji, right? Like a lot of people now text differently. You don't want to show teeth, you do want to show teeth, etc., etc., etc. These types of symbols are empowering and important to the idea of language in its full narrative. So this brings us to the end of this lecture. I want to keep these short, so I'm going to end here. Don't forget to do your Yellow Dig posts and know your quiz online. I will be having another video under this. Watch it after that. I'm going to go a little deeper into culture, talk about some of the culture shocks, ethnocentrism, and whatnot. But for the sake of this one, we are at a point where I'm going to stop here. Please make sure to watch this. Hopefully you've enjoyed this. There's some good points here for Yellow Dig. Maybe use those for your inspiration. You need to make sure you stay on top of Yellow Dig. But yeah, the next lecture will be covering some more constructs around the idea of culture. So I will see you there.